Excuse me, sir. Are you sure you're not sitting in the wrong seat?
This is first class.
No mistake, ma'am. Seat 2B. This is my ticket.
She ordered the veteran out of his seat. Minutes later, the pilot saluted and froze the whole plane. When corporate executive Victoria Sterling demanded that the smelly old man be removed from first class, she had no idea she was humiliating Medal of Honor recipient Colonel James Mitchell. But when the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom with a stunning announcement, the entire plane would witness justice served at 30,000 feet. Flight 447 from Chicago to Los Angeles hummed with the quiet efficiency of a Tuesday morning departure. The Boeing 777 was filled with business travelers, vacationing families, and the usual mix of passengers, settling in for the 4-hour journey across America's heartland. First-class passengers sipped their pre-flight champagne, while coach passengers stowed carry-ons and claimed armrests. The cabin crew moved through their practiced routines, checking seatbelts and preparing for takeoff. It was the kind of routine flight that would normally be forgotten by evening, until one passenger's cruelty would transform it into a moment of national significance. Colonel James Mitchell, 82, carefully made his way down the aircraft aisle, his weathered hands gripping his boarding pass with the precision of someone who had learned to hold onto important documents during decades of military service. His gray hair was neatly combed, his khaki pants pressed with military creases, and his simple white shirt bore the faint outline of medals he no longer wore in public. The years had been hard on James. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Iraq, and a final deployment to Afghanistan at age 70 had left their mark on his body and spirit. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 6 months ago, and he was traveling to Los Angeles to visit their daughter, Sarah, who was worried about his increasing isolation and depression. James moved slowly, his left leg stiff from shrapnel that had never fully healed, his breathing labored from lungs damaged by Agent Orange exposure decades earlier. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much but had never lost his faith in duty, honor, and service. The Medal of Honor citation in his wallet, worn soft from years of carrying, told the story of a day in 1968 when he had saved 17 soldiers at the cost of his own health. Victoria Sterling occupied seat 2A, her designer suit, immaculate her laptop, open to quarterly profit reports that demanded her attention. As the CEO of Sterling Financial, she was accustomed to first-class service and the respect that came with success. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from subordinates, and she answered each one with the crisp efficiency of someone who measured time in billable hours. When James approached his assigned seat, 2B right next to her, Victoria's perfectly manicured nose wrinkled in disgust. The elderly man carried the faint scent of medication and the mustiness that sometimes accompanied age, a reminder of mortality that Victoria found deeply offensive in her carefully controlled environment. "Excuse me," Victoria said sharply to flight attendant Jennifer Walsh as James settled into his seat. "There's been some mistake. This man clearly doesn't belong in first class." Jennifer, a 15-year veteran of the airline industry, had seen every type of passenger complaint imaginable. She approached with professional courtesy, though her eyes immediately recognized the quiet dignity in James's bearing. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to check his boarding pass," Jennifer replied diplomatically. James silently handed over his ticket, his hand steady, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. The boarding pass clearly showed seat 2B first class, purchased with miles he had accumulated over decades of military travel. "His ticket is correct, ma'am," Jennifer confirmed. "Mr. Mitchell is in his assigned seat." Victoria's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "I don't care what his ticket says. I paid full price for first class, and I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who obviously can't afford to be here. The smell is unbearable." James' face flushed with shame, but he remained silent. He had faced enemy fire, survived prisoner of war camps, and buried too many friends to be broken by one woman's cruelty. But the words still cut deep. "Ma'am," Jennifer said, her voice remaining professional despite her growing anger, "all passengers with valid tickets are welcome in their assigned seats. If you're uncomfortable, I can see if there are other available seats." "I'm not moving," Victoria snapped. "He is. I have an important presentation to prepare for, and I can't concentrate with this sitting next to me." Other first-class passengers began to stare, some with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort at the scene unfolding. James started to stand, his pride wounded, but his dignity intact. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command despite his current humiliation. "I can move to coach." "No," Jennifer said firmly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "You're staying right here." But Victoria wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and began recording. "I'm documenting this for my lawyer. This airline is forcing me to sit next to someone who clearly has hygiene issues. This is discrimination against paying customers." The recording captured James's face as he absorbed the insult, his military bearing the only thing preventing him from breaking down entirely. Other passengers began pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Senior flight attendant Marcus Rodriguez had been watching the situation develop from the galley. A former Marine himself, he recognized something in James's bearing that Victoria and the other passengers had missed: the unmistakable posture of a career military officer. Marcus approached James directly, ignoring Victoria's continued complaints. "Sir, may I ask, did you serve?" James looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes with the recognition that passed between veterans. "Yes, Army, retired colonel." "Which conflict, sir?" "Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan." James's voice was barely above a whisper, but Marcus heard every word. Marcus's expression changed completely. He had served in Iraq himself and knew the weight those words carried. A colonel who had served in 3 conflicts wasn't just any veteran. He was a warrior who had dedicated his entire life to service. "Sir, would you mind if I spoke with the captain? I think there's something he should know." James nodded, unsure what Marcus intended, but trusting in the bond that connected those who had served. Victoria continued her tirade, unaware that the dynamic on the plane was about to shift dramatically. "This is ridiculous," she declared to anyone who would listen. "I'm never flying this airline again." Captain Sarah Chen had been flying commercial aircraft for 20 years, but her heart still belonged to the Air Force, where she had served as a transport pilot before transitioning to civilian aviation. When Marcus Rodriguez knocked on the cockpit door with an urgent request, she listened with growing amazement. "Captain, we have a situation in first class," Marcus began. "There's a passenger being harassed, and I think you need to know who he is." Marcus quickly explained the confrontation, but more importantly, he shared what he had learned about James Mitchell. "Ma'am, I looked him up on my phone. Colonel James Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient. He saved 17 soldiers in Vietnam, was wounded 3 times, and continued serving until he was 75 years old. Captain Chen's hand stilled on her pre-flight checklist. She had grown up hearing stories about Medal of Honor recipients, and she knew that fewer than 3,500 people in American history had received the nation's highest military decoration. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I found his citation online. He's a living legend, and some corporate executive is treating him like garbage because of how he smells." Captain Chen made a decision that would change everyone's flight experience. Captain Chen quickly researched James Mitchell on her tablet, while her co-pilot completed the pre-flight procedures. What she found took her breath away. The citation for his Medal of Honor told the story of a 22-year-old lieutenant who had single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 6 hours, allowing his surrounded platoon to be evacuated. But that was just the beginning. James Mitchell had continued serving for over 50 years, earning multiple Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, and Silver Stars. He had commanded troops in some of America's most dangerous missions, mentored thousands of young soldiers, and had been personally decorated by 4 different presidents. The most recent articles about him were heartbreaking. His wife Margaret had died 6 months earlier, and James had been struggling with depression and isolation. The article mentioned that he was traveling to see his daughter, who was concerned about his mental health following his wife's death. Captain Chen realized that the man being humiliated in first class wasn't just any veteran. He was one of America's greatest living heroes, traveling alone to visit family while grieving the loss of his life partner. She knew exactly what she had to do. Captain Chen called an emergency crew meeting, gathering all flight attendants in the galley while passengers settled in for departure. Her announcement was brief but powerful. "We have a Medal of Honor recipient on board," she said quietly. "Colonel James Mitchell, seat 2B. He's being harassed by another passenger, and we're going to handle this appropriately." The crew's reaction was immediate and unanimous. Jennifer Walsh, who had been trying to protect James from Victoria's abuse, felt vindicated in her instincts. Marcus Rodriguez nodded grimly, having suspected that James's service record was extraordinary. "Here's what we're going to do," Captain Chen continued. "I'm going to make an announcement once we're airborne. But first, I want everyone to understand who this man is." She read excerpts from James's Medal of Honor citation, describing how he had crawled through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, how he had called in artillery strikes on his own position to break an enemy assault, and how he had refused medical evacuation until every member of his unit was safe. "This man is a national treasure," Captain Chen concluded, "and he's going to be treated with the respect he deserves." As the plane taxied toward the runway, the crew implemented their plan with military precision. Marcus Rodriguez quietly approached James and whispered that the captain would like to speak with him after takeoff. James nodded, confused but trusting. Jennifer Walsh began preparing the first-class cabin for what was about to happen, ensuring that other passengers were comfortable and that Victoria Sterling's complaints were documented for later review. Captain Chen used the taxi time to contact the airline's corporate office, informing them of the situation and requesting permission to handle it as she saw fit. The response was immediate and supportive. The airline wanted to ensure that a Medal of Honor recipient received appropriate treatment. Meanwhile, word was spreading quietly through the cabin as crew members shared James's story with select passengers. The mood began to shift as people realized they were in the presence of genuine American heroism. Victoria Sterling remained oblivious to the changing atmosphere, continuing to complain about her seating situation and threatening legal action. She had no idea that her behavior was being documented not just by passengers, but by the crew, and that her actions would soon be broadcast to the entire plane. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, Victoria Sterling's patience finally snapped completely. She stood up in the aisle, her voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin and into the forward section of coach. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she declared, pointing at James, who sat quietly reading a worn paperback novel. "I paid $8,000 for this seat, and I'm being forced to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class. The smell is making me nauseous, and the airline is doing nothing about it." Her voice grew louder as she warmed to her theme, drawing out her phone to record her complaint. "I'm Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Financial, and I'm documenting this discrimination against paying customers. This man obviously can't afford first class and is probably using some kind of charity ticket or veterans discount." The words hit James like physical blows. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but this public humiliation in front of dozens of strangers was almost unbearable. His hands trembled slightly as he closed his book, and for a moment, the proud colonel who had commanded thousands of soldiers looked like nothing more than a frail, embarrassed old man. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Jennifer Walsh said firmly. But Victoria was beyond reason. "I want him moved to coach where he belongs, or I want a full refund and compensation for this nightmare flight." Victoria's tirade reached its crescendo when she made a fatal mistake. Emboldened by what she perceived as the crew's inaction, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "Since no one else will handle this situation, I will," she announced, reaching across James to grab his boarding pass. "Let me see what kind of discount ticket you're using, old man." James instinctively pulled back, protecting his boarding pass, but Victoria's grabbing motion knocked his book to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, a small leather wallet fell from his jacket pocket, spilling its contents across the aisle. Among the scattered items was a faded photograph of James in his dress uniform standing next to President Johnson as the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. There was also his military ID card, clearly showing his rank and service record. Victoria, still in her fury, didn't recognize the significance of what she was seeing. "Fake military ID?" she scoffed. "Probably bought it online to get veteran discounts. This is fraud." But other passengers had seen the photograph and the ID. A businessman in seat 3A himself, a veteran, recognized the Medal of Honor ceremony photo immediately. His sharp intake of breath caught the attention of nearby passengers who began leaning forward to see what had fallen from James's wallet. "Ma'am," the businessman said quietly to Victoria, "you need to stop talking right now." But Victoria was beyond listening. "Don't tell me what to do. This fraud is probably stealing valor, pretending to be a veteran for sympathy and discounts. I've seen this before. Homeless people buying fake military gear to panhandle." The accusation of stolen valor was the final straw. James's face went pale and his breathing became labored. The suggestion that he was faking his military service was more painful than any physical wound he had ever received. Captain Chen had been monitoring the situation through crew reports, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Victoria's accusation of stolen valor was that moment. She activated the cabin intercom system, her voice carrying clearly throughout the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need to interrupt our flight service for a moment to address a situation in the cabin." The plane fell completely silent. Even Victoria stopped talking, surprised by the unexpected announcement. "We have a very special passenger on board today," Captain Chen continued, her voice filled with respect and authority. "In seat 2B sits Colonel James Mitchell, United States Army retired. Colonel Mitchell is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Victoria's face went white as she began to realize the magnitude of her mistake. Colonel Mitchell earned his Medal of Honor in Vietnam in 1968 when he single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 6 hours, saving the lives of 17 American soldiers. He continued serving our country for over 50 years through multiple conflicts, earning numerous decorations for valor and leadership. Captain Chen paused, letting the weight of her words sink in throughout the cabin. Captain Chen's voice continued over the intercom, each word carefully chosen to honor the man who had been so cruelly treated. Colonel Mitchell served 3 combat tours in Vietnam, 2 in Iraq, and 1 final deployment to Afghanistan at the age of 70. He has been wounded in action multiple times and has been personally decorated by 4 United States presidents for his extraordinary service to our nation. The cabin remained absolutely silent, with every passenger hanging on the captain's words. Victoria Sterling stood frozen in the aisle, her face a mask of horror, as she realized the enormity of her mistake. Colonel Mitchell recently lost his beloved wife Margaret after 58 years of marriage, and he is traveling today to visit his daughter. He represents the very best of American military service: courage, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. Captain Chen paused again, her own emotion evident in her voice. "As a former Air Force officer myself, I am honored to have Colonel Mitchell aboard our aircraft. Sir, on behalf of this crew and this airline, thank you for your service to our nation." The captain's final words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Colonel Mitchell, would you please join me in the cockpit? I would be honored to meet you personally." The effect of Captain Chen's announcement was immediate and profound. The entire cabin erupted in spontaneous applause that lasted for several minutes. Passengers stood, some wiping away tears, others saluting if they knew how. The businessman in 3A, himself a veteran, was the first to approach James. "Sir, it would be my honor to shake your hand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. James stood slowly, his earlier humiliation replaced by overwhelming gratitude. As he made his way toward the cockpit, passenger after passenger reached out to touch his hand, thank him for his service, or simply nod with respect. Victoria Sterling remained frozen in the aisle, her phone still recording, but now capturing her own public humiliation rather than James's. The other passengers' expressions toward her ranged from disgust to outright anger. She had not just insulted an elderly man, she had attacked a national hero. For a moment, James hesitated at the cockpit door. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had spent recent months in isolation and grief. The public recognition felt surreal after the private pain of losing Margaret and the loneliness that had consumed him since her death. Marcus Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant who had first recognized James's military bearing placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sir, you deserve this recognition. You've earned it 1,000 times over." James thought of Margaret, who had always been proud of his service, but had encouraged him to be humble about his decorations. "She would want me to accept this gracefully," he thought. He straightened his shoulders, drawing on the military bearing that had sustained him through decades of service. The frail, embarrassed old man was gone, replaced by the colonel who had commanded respect on battlefields around the world. James knocked on the cockpit door, ready to meet his fellow veteran. Captain Chen stood as James entered the cockpit, immediately coming to attention and rendering a crisp military salute. Her co-pilot, First Officer Martinez, followed suit. The gesture brought tears to James's eyes. It had been months since anyone had acknowledged his military service with such respect. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Captain Sarah Chen, former Air Force. This is First Officer Martinez, former Navy. Sir, it is an absolute honor to meet you." James returned the salute with the precision of a career officer. "The honor is mine, Captain. Thank you for your service." "Sir, I've read your citation. What you did in Vietnam, there aren't words for that kind of courage." James's voice was quiet, but steady. "I was just doing my job, Captain, taking care of my soldiers." "That's what makes you a hero, sir. You never stop taking care of your people." Captain Chen gestured toward the pilot seat. "Sir, would you like to see how we fly these birds?" While James visited the cockpit, the cabin underwent a complete transformation. Passengers who had witnessed Victoria's attack began sharing their own military connections. Sons and daughters serving overseas, fathers who had fought in previous wars, family members who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The businessman in 3A, Colonel retired David Park, took charge of organizing the passengers' response. "That woman attacked a Medal of Honor recipient," he said quietly to those around him. "We need to make sure Colonel Mitchell knows how we really feel about his service." Passengers began writing notes of thanks on napkins, boarding passes, and pieces of paper. Flight attendants collected phone numbers from those who wanted to send proper thank you letters after the flight. Someone started a collection to send flowers to Margaret Mitchell's grave. Victoria Sterling had retreated to her seat, her earlier bravado completely deflated. She sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that she had publicly humiliated one of America's greatest living heroes. Other passengers no longer tried to hide their contempt for her actions. Jennifer Walsh approached Victoria with professional courtesy, but unmistakable firmness. "Ma'am, the captain has asked me to inform you that your behavior is being reported to airline management and that you may face restrictions on future travel." When James returned from the cockpit, the entire cabin stood in ovation. Captain Chen had given him a pair of pilot's wings, a small gesture that meant everything to a man who had spent his life in service to others. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying the authority of command despite his emotional state, "I want to thank you for your kindness. This old soldier has been reminded today that America is still full of good people who remember those who serve." He looked directly at Victoria Sterling, his expression not angry, but profoundly sad. "Ma'am, I hope you'll remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. A little kindness goes a long way." The grace in his response to her cruelty only made Victoria's behavior seem more shameful by comparison. James had responded to hatred with dignity, to insult with forgiveness. The remainder of Flight 447 became an impromptu celebration of military service and American heroism. Passengers shared stories, thanked James repeatedly, and created an atmosphere of respect and gratitude that transformed the entire flight experience. Victoria Sterling spent the rest of the flight in mortified silence, her earlier arrogance replaced by the crushing realization of her mistake. Video of her attack on James, recorded by multiple passengers, began circulating on social media before the plane even landed. James found himself surrounded by new friends, people who wanted to hear his stories and share their own connections to military service. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt connected to his community and valued for his contributions. The airline's corporate response was swift and decisive. Victoria Sterling was banned from future flights, and the company issued a public statement supporting veterans and condemning discrimination. James was offered free flights for life and a formal apology from the airline CEO. The video of Victoria's attack and the subsequent revelation of James's heroic service went viral, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. The story became a powerful reminder about the importance of treating all people with dignity and the danger of making assumptions based on appearance. James became an inadvertent spokesperson for veteran recognition, appearing on news programs and speaking at events about the challenges facing aging veterans. His story inspired increased support for veteran services and greater awareness of the heroes living quietly in communities across America. The incident led to enhanced sensitivity training for airline personnel and new policies protecting veterans from discrimination. Victoria Sterling's company faced public backlash, ultimately leading to her resignation and a corporate commitment to veteran hiring and support programs. Most importantly, James found renewed purpose in his final years, using his platform to advocate for veteran mental health services and to ensure that other aging heroes received the recognition and support they deserved. 6 months after the flight, James stood at Margaret's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, no longer the broken, isolated man who had boarded Flight 447. In his hands, he held hundreds of letters from passengers who had been on the plane, people who had been inspired by his story, and veterans who had found hope in his example. "Maggie," he said softly to the headstone, "I think I'm going to be okay. That terrible day on the plane, it reminded me that there are still good people in this world, people who remember what service means." The wind rustled through the trees as James placed a small American flag by Margaret's grave, the same flag that Captain Chen had given him during the flight. He was no longer forgotten. He was no longer alone, and his service would never again be questioned or diminished. She humiliated a hero, but America remembered who he really was.